My name's Anthony, and today my talk is called Ringfence the Chaos when technical teams meet organizational systems. Just a little bit about me. I'm currently head of development for a company called Liquid Metrics. We're a fintech data analytics company. I am an ambassador for Git Kraken, so hit me up if you want a discount. I'm also a Scrum Master and a Agile leader, and I have certifications in Umbraco, an Umbraco Master, and an MVP. So Ringfence the Chaos. What motivated this talk? So I've been head of development for a couple of companies, CTO for a tiny little startup, and tech director in my previous company. And I've been working in agencies a lot, which meant that I had a lot of opportunities to consult with all types of companies, large and small, and I was also freelancing for a while. I've been exposed to lots of different types of development and organizational processes, the teams and project management methodologies, which I've been exposed to, have really opened my eyes on how different organizations and departments work. And I'm quite interested in inefficient environments and chaotic environments. So basically, my background is in agencies. If anyone has ever worked in an agency, you know what I mean. So this is the part where I would normally ask my audience what their backgrounds are, but I'm just going to assume that there are some people that have worked in an agency before or an integrated agency. There's a lot of you who have been in companies that have more than 100 people. Everyone here probably has a development background of some sort. And some of you will be in leadership positions. I want to start with a story. So many years ago, I was a contractor for a large agency, and I was contracted to do a project which was quite heavy in documentation. This was back when Clippy was still a thing, so that's how long ago it was. This project was for an Umbraco website, and Umbraco has a SQL database because that's just how Umbraco is made. It requires a database. During that time, when I was developing, I was wondering, okay, how do I provision a database? So I asked the lead developer, how do I get a database provisions? And he said, well, you need to ask the IT department. So I thought, okay, cool. We'll ask the IT department. How does that work? It went a little bit like this. So I had to send a request to the lead developer via email. He sent the request to the PM. The PM, of course, said no. And then after a little bit of discussion, the PM finally said, okay, cool, I'll send the request to the finance department. And this is when things started getting a little bit strange. What does finance have to do with provisioning a database for development and staging and production? Well, it was an extra cost to the project. So of course they said no. And after some discussions, back and forth emails, we finally convinced them that it needs to be part of the project because it's an Umbraco website and Umbraco needs a database. So eventually we sent a request for a quote to the IT department, which was super strange because why would the IT department need to quote on something? Well, it turns out they were a different kind of tax entity for, let's say, tax efficiencies. And yeah, this went back and forth a little bit. And eventually we got to book for the database to be created. A couple of weeks later, and many, many emails with about 5 or 6 people in the chain, the person that was meant to create the database called in sick. So what ended up happening was we'd had to go back a couple steps, rebook for the database to be created, and then eventually the database was created. So this process took around about 3 weeks with around about 5 people in an email chain and lots of back and forth discussions. So just to give everyone an idea of what's happening, this is how you create a database in SQL Server. So you right-click, create a database, type the database name, and you click OK. That's it. That's all they really needed to do. They could have scripted this as well. Obviously, there's giving login credentials, but that's basically the same process. So what was going on in this organization? Well, firstly, there were multiple approval gates, which didn't really make sense. For some reason, everything needed to go through finance because finance controlled all of the flow of information. There was heavy documentation, which was kind of useless because if the documentation was done properly, then they would have spec'd out the fact that Umbraco needs a SQL database, and it would have been part of the whole entire solution, but it wasn't there. We had some interdepartmental dependencies and dependencies on individuals within the organization to say yes. And overall, we just had a lot of bottlenecks. So the cogs weren't really turning very fast in this organization. So how do you know if you're a bottleneck? Whether it's your team or yourself or your department, you may be thinking that you're really fast, but externally they may have a different opinion of how efficient you are. When it comes to knowing whether you're a bottleneck or knowing when bottlenecks are part of your organization, something that is real telltale is morale. So I was working in a company, working for a company, consulting for them, and there was a Visual Studio solution that had over 130 Visual Studio projects in there. And this took ages to build. Which, like a normal project takes like a minute. This was taking well over 10 minutes to build. And I was complaining about this. And then one developer poked his head over his desk and said, "That doesn't stop you from getting paid, does it?" And at that point, I realized how bad the morale was in this company. So the morale was so poor that they didn't care about keeping things efficient. And another thing that happened in this company was I was there to teach them how to use Umbraco at the time. And the guy that was shadowing me was meant to be paying attention and learning. So I was typing away, talking about what I was doing and showing him things. I didn't get any response from him for a while. And then I turned my head and it turned out the guy was asleep. So yeah, morale is definitely a telltale about efficiencies in an organization. So when it comes to measuring whether you are actually efficient or not, we've already taken a look at how long it takes to complete something. Creating a database takes a minute. I mean, even if you include turning on your computer, opening up your management studio, taking your time to connect to the database server, and then eventually creating the database, it only takes a few minutes. I mean, you could make that an hour if you wanted to. Let's just bump up that estimate. But the actual time it took end to end from the outsider's perspective was 3 weeks. So really, when you're talking about measurements about how fast you are, you really need to think about from the moment you agree to do the work, how long until you actually deliver the work. And that's very, very different. And that's the thing that people will notice the most, not how fast you do things inside your organization. Failing that, if you don't have these types of measurements, one easy thing to do is to ask other departments or external people how fast you're going. Do you work fast enough so that their teams can stay efficient? And you'll be surprised, the answer is normally no. And they normally can give you some tips on why they think things should be faster. So that's not very scientific, but at least that's a starting point. So when it comes to internal bottlenecks, they can normally be categorized into processes and policies, your general flow of work, how you organize your work, and also your staff configuration and skills shortages. I want to tell you another story. When I was consulting for a company that had a marketing department that had a lot of friction with the IT department. They wanted to have a Wi-Fi router installed because they wanted to move around with their laptops, go into a meeting room, have connections available wherever. And of course, the IT department said no. From the IT department's perspective, that totally made sense. It's more secure to have cables. Why would you have Wi-Fi, which people can potentially hack into? Well, okay, they had this policy of no Wi-Fi in the organization. What do you think the marketing department did? They went out shopping and they bought a Wi-Fi router and they installed it themselves. So as far as I know, the IT department never found out about this. So when it comes to policies and processes, policies and processes have valid reasons. They tend to be there to mitigate error, improve quality, protect the team from interference or from hindrances. But the thing is, they need to be fit for purpose. So if your policies and processes are actually hindering productivity, then it's not really giving much business value. So there needs to be a balance of what you need to achieve versus what the business actually needs in terms of processes. And if you can easily subvert these processes, then they probably don't have that much value. So you need to think about that balance. And this goes not just for IT departments, but for all types of processes. And if people are asking why things are slow, then you can pretty much bet that something that you've done in terms of processes and policies is a little bit inefficient. When it comes to flow, often in organizations, people have a mindset of when can we start the work, rather than when can we actually finish the work. So there is this mindset of let's book some work in, but people don't tend to know when something can be finished. We'll have roadmaps, but we might start more work than we can actually achieve. So I'll give you an example. Here are 3 people at the top, and here are some project managers, and they all need some work done. So they'll book in some time and they'll get some work done. But what happens when one person calls in sick or goes on vacation or is just unavailable for some reason or is held up on another project because projects go a lot longer? Well, then you have these really upset project managers. They can't get their work done. 20% of your flow is just stopped dead in its tracks. If you reorganize the way you do your work in your organization, you can have a situation where the first team or the first person available can actually do the work. So when you have one person or one team unavailable, things can still actually keep moving. Speaking of teams, when it comes to resourcing, I'm sure a lot of you have seen situations where you have scheduling conflicts or people are shuffled between teams because of skills shortages. But you have to realize that if you need to do this, then your organization probably isn't as efficient as it should be. So if someone is shuffled between a team, what you're essentially doing is sacrificing the productivity of one team for another team. But that's not all. What you're actually doing also is creating a silo. So you're creating a silo in this one person and a dependency. So now this person is a dependency of 2 different projects. So then, of course, what happens if this person leaves the company or calls in sick, goes on vacation, or is just unavailable for some reason? Well, now you have 2 teams that are inefficient. So when it comes to team configuration, I like to think of teams as skill sets, not people. Very often you'll see teams full of experts. Experts are quite preferable for most people because an expert can do architecture. They can do things like optimizations, like SQL optimizations. But the problem is experts tend to also be silos because they tend to be very, very good at one thing, but they can't help with other things. So say, for instance, a really good SQL person may not know how to do backend development or DevOps. But if there's no SQL needed for them to do, then they kind of sit there waiting for work. And that's also very inefficient. So then you have people that are experts waiting for work, but the work doesn't pop up all the time. They have to wait for it. So then you get these silos of one as well, because if they go away or call in sick, well, there goes your SQL expert or there goes your DevOps expert. On the flip side, you have generalists where they can basically do everything. They tend to be good at things like maintenance. It's quite efficient to use a generalist for maintenance, but they tend to yield suboptimal results. And if you look at code bases over time, a generalist a team of generalists may end up adding entropy and a lot of code debt into your code base. So I'll give you an example. In my previous company, we had outsourced maintenance to another company for some projects, and the code was so bad that we were rejecting pull requests all the time. This was before I arrived at the company, but I heard that at some point the code was consistently so bad that the developers stopped looking at the pull requests and just accepted them because they knew that it was going to be bad. And the code had become so bad over time. And this is a real shame because it doesn't have to be this way. So when it comes to skill sets in a team, in my opinion, on average, a really good productive team is generalists with specializations. So what I mean is someone that can do backend and DevOps, backend and SQL, backend and search, maybe front end and a bit of QA automation, QA and asset creation. So in this scenario, I tend to like something in the order of about 60–70% of the team having full of generalists with specializations. So they can help each other and they can share their knowledge. And this ends up being quite efficient. That's not to say that you don't need experts, but the majority of the work that you do in any given project, at least the ones that I've worked on, I got away with generalists that had specializations. And then maybe I needed to bring in a security expert to fix a security issue after a penetration test, or maybe a SQL optimization needed looking at. So I brought in a SQL person, but that SQL person wouldn't be there the whole project. That would be there for part of the project. We've seen how team configuration can impact our ability to deliver, but understanding the type of work that you do, the type of service you do, also helps you inform the way that you run your processes, run and create the processes. So I'll give you some examples. Typically in an organization, you'll have things like projects. So the projects could go anywhere between a couple of weeks or even up to a couple of years, all different sizes. Everyone has to deal with support and maintenance at some point. So that's your business as usual type stuff. There's always an emergency that pops up. So your website is down, or maybe there's a security problem, or a client is just a client or stakeholder is just really annoyed at something, and you just need to jump because you need to repair that relationship. That's an emergency. There's also consultancy and pitch work and types of meetings. And if you're really, really lucky, you work in an agency and you get to do all of the above, probably all in the same day. And that's basically everything in the kitchen sink. So how do these service types affect the way that you do things? Okay, so here's an example. Here's a hipster developer, and he gets booked to do things. All right, you can't really book emergencies. They just happen. So you kind of shuffle this person around between projects and a bit of maintenance, some consultancy, back to projects again, until an emergency happens. Okay, so the way of working in this organization is you book someone until an emergency pops up. Okay, what about DevOps? This is something that tends to be complex. Well, it doesn't have to be complex, but it tends to also be often delayed or forgotten, and people kind of assume that deployments happen. So if you're doing development, your team just assumes that it gets deployed at some point, especially the higher up in the organization. They just assume that when you did the work, it was deployed. I was in a situation once where I had a look through some code. I looked through the code repo and I saw all these old pull requests. And one of them was about 6 months old and had hundreds of commits that came afterwards. Okay, so no one ever deployed this stuff. When I asked what it was, people said, well, we did the work, but no one deployed it because no one booked in a deploy. It's like, okay, well, what do you think I had to do with this? Well, the only thing I can do with something that's 6 months old with hundreds of commits afterwards is basically to just delete it, which is essentially throwing away money. So here you can see that the type of work that you do really influences how the processes should operate. So in this organization, there should have been some sort of team around this that was responsible for deployment and development, or you could have a process where the developer that does the work is responsible until it gets deployed, and they're the ones that has to push it all the way through to get deployed. So when it comes to processes and systems, there are some challenges that you have to overcome. There can be a lot of friction as well. I'm not sure whether this was the case in other countries, but definitely in the UK in March, you would go to the supermarket and you would go to the toilet paper aisle and it would basically look like this. So this was basically because people thought that they were going to run out of toilet paper, so they bought more, and they ended up causing the problem that they thought was going to happen. And this is quite common when it comes to booking people in organizations. If people are afraid that they might not get their favorite developer or the best designer or a group of skill sets, then they may just book ahead of time because they know, well, I know that this project is coming up. I'm going to book a whole bunch of people just so that I have them available. But then what you've ended up doing is you've caused other people to think, oh, well, there's a lack of skills. I better pre-book as well. And you ended up getting this habit forming. And old habits are really, really hard to break. But it makes sense for a project manager to want to do this. They want to make sure that their project is successful and they want all the skill sets available. It's just that when the systems and habits are there, they can cause problems. So a system or a piece of software can be a central nexus in an organization. It can be the central point for all of the operations, and it can feel quite safe because you're trained to use this system, and as long as you plug your numbers in, you've done your job. Your KPIs are that you keep track of everything and the system is up to date. But the problem is, with my previous company, we found that the workflow system was quite inefficient. This is quite common in agencies, having to book all different types of work all the time. So we wanted to break away from how the system was working. So we decided, okay, let's see if we can just put in generic names. So we said, okay, let's put generic developers and generic designers in there and allow external project managers outside of the tech team to book a generic person, which totally made sense because it meant that we didn't have to change any habits of other people. All they needed to do was book a generic person. It just said generic developer. But the problem is external PMs decided that they didn't like this because they felt like they were losing control. They felt like they didn't know who was going to do their work because prior to this, they were very used to booking their favorite developer or that person who they know is really good at that one thing that they need. So they definitely wanted to know who could do the work. And that's not something that we could provide because projects go over time, emergencies happen, some ad hoc things occur. Maybe there's a server patch that needs to happen, and maybe that person that would have worked on your project is now working on a server patch. Who knows? So we wanted to break away from this, but it caused a lot of friction, and it definitely shook the trusts. So when it comes to breaking away from old systems, changing the way we worked actually caused people externally to think that we were being less collaborative, which is definitely not the case. We still wanted to be more, we actually wanted to be more collaborative with other departments, but they thought that we were being less collaborative because we were blocking the view of who was going to do the work. In reality, we didn't know who was going to do the work because things get shuffled around all the time in agencies. We just wanted to make it clear that you would have someone available. In hindsight, I probably would have spent a lot more time trying to ask what potential concerns would be. So getting buy-in from external people outside of the department to try to reassure them. I would have also explicitly mentioned that there would be bumps and there would be a bit of discomfort, and just to work with us to try to resolve these. I definitely didn't think of the human aspect of discomfort when we were introducing these changes. So yeah, we did ruffle a lot of feathers externally, and if anyone's interested, this is called a silky chicken. This was one of the first things that came up when I Googled ruffled feathers. So when it comes to change, getting people to accept changes, it can be quite difficult, especially when they need to change their habits. If they need to adopt new processes, then that's something that they need to learn. So getting someone to learn new things, just so that your department or your team can be a bit more efficient, that can be problematic. Getting people to abandon old ways of doing things and old systems, that is really problematic, because you've just destroyed someone's worldview of what it means to do their job well. Yeah, if I had the time again, I definitely would have spent more time trying to not ruffle so many feathers. But I guess the key is like, people don't like change, and you just have to be very, very friendly about it, and try to be supportive of the people that you're going to affect. And you definitely have to be aware of the fact that you're going to affect other people in an organization. So when it comes to processes and methodologies, well, it's not always as simple as wanting to do agile or waterfall or Scrum or extreme programming. It often depends on the maturity of your team. So here's a little simple diagram which shows the evolution of how teams and organizations can mature. So on the left there, you have ad hoc, which is basically, we don't have processes. And then you move into analytic, which is essentially, we have built a lot of processes which all make sense, but then that's quite rigid. And then at some point, as the organization matures, you will get a relaxing of those rules and policies. And then eventually you'll get into a situation where you have something that resembles a chaotic environment, but is actually more like an organized chaos. So the team doesn't follow all of these rigid policies, but they know how to get work done, and they know how to do it well. So this is just a very simple chart, but there are other more complex versions of this, but it kind of gives you an idea of how teams evolve. When it comes to project management methodologies, Waterfall is something that I guess most developers would hate to work in. You have all these upfront phases. So you might have initiate, discover, explore, design. There goes about 70% of the budget and time, and you're only left with a little bit to build and then test and deploy. And of course, because Waterfall is staged, you don't do any of the rigorous testing until the end. And then you don't even consider deployment until the end as well. So I think everyone's worked in some sort of Waterfall project where things have been left all the way to the end, and they've just had problems, and the project ends up going overtime. Well, it doesn't have to be this way, but sometimes you're kind of forced into a Waterfall project. And this can be because of the stakeholder. So when you're dealing with stakeholders such as government or legal or medicine, they tend to be highly prescriptive, and they kind of have to be, because you don't want a medical system that's run kind of in an ad hoc way where you only half make some features, because if you do it badly, you may end up costing lives or causing medical problems. So these types of things need to be heavily prescriptive, and you need to actually document a lot of things. So you're forced to work in a waterfall situation, or at least a heavily documented one. So the project type also matters. So if you're in a situation where you need to do a lot of design or brand work, organizations that want to change their image, well, that can be quite prescriptive as well. You wouldn't exactly do like A/B testing for an image change of a brand. I don't think any company would accept something like this. Let's try these colors for 2 years, and then if it doesn't work, we'll change to another, or we'll advertise blue and in one billboard and red in another. It just doesn't happen. But there is a way that you can make Waterfall a lot smoother, and that's by adding a few agile principles. So you don't have to test at the end. Like a really good developer, doesn't matter what methodology they're using, they will write unit tests and integration tests for the features that they're making. And they'll do this either ideally before they start writing the code or during. The key is that they'll have the tests to run and they'll have them when they're doing the code. And another thing you could do is you could add in status meetings. So if you have a stakeholder and they want to run everything in Waterfall, that's fine. But they also want status meetings, right? So you bring them close together and you say, let's have a status meeting once a month or once every 2 months. That way we can give you a status report and we can have a discussion about progress. And that's an opportunity for you to demo what you've done. And they will definitely give feedback. And at that point you can say, okay, cool. We have time to fix or resolve that issue. Another thing you can do is add sprints inside your Waterfall. So you can run Agile inside a Waterfall project. So you can do 2-week, 3-week, 4-week sprints and iterate. And you can deploy to a production environment at any point. It doesn't like doing Waterfall doesn't mean that you can't deploy anywhere. It means that the final rigorous testing is a stage that everyone knows is going to happen, and the deployment is another stage that everyone knows is going to happen. But you can do these things also during development. So when it comes to a team that's starting to be more agile, the level of maturity and how long the team has been together and how their skills have evolved really matters. So a team that has only just been together won't be able to deploy to production very quickly. In fact, I've been in a few teams where the teams were put together and we weren't able to deploy reliably to an environment until 2 or 3 months down the line because there's a disagreement about what technologies should be used. Should it be TeamCity? Should it be Vayer? Should it be something else? And then the configuration really depends on who knows how to configure that tool, and then getting the processes right and getting the DevOps pipelines working in a way that's efficient, that works with the way that the team wants to work, can actually take several weeks. So definitely a team that is quite young won't be able to deploy very quickly, at least not in the first few weeks. Definitely the way people communicate is a huge factor. So it takes time for people to gel, and a team that's been together for years, they all know each other in and out. So so they'll be able to know who can do what and what the efficiencies are. But it takes time to get there, and it takes time to know what people are capable of. When it comes to teams and an organization, leadership is also a huge factor. So if you're in an organization that has hierarchical decision-making, this really needs to be broken down to allow the teams to actually get the job done. So a project doesn't need so many hierarchical improvement gates. Just let the team make their own decision, give them a budget to work with, and they can just deal with it. So when it comes to learning how to be more agile in your processes, if you haven't done agile before, the team will definitely need some sort of structure, some rituals and policies. I'm Scrum certified, so I'm biased, but for me, Scrum is a really simple framework to adopt. Any team can adopt this. It's basically a set of time-boxed, purposeful meetings, which is a planning meeting where you plan out the work for the sprint, a daily scrum where you unblock the work, a review at the end of the sprint of what was done, and then a retrospective about how the work could have been done faster, what blockages did we have. And teams that are learning how to do Agile will tend to want to deploy on a cadence. They wouldn't want to deploy ad hocly because they feel that they need to prepare the work to be deployed. But they soon realize that they don't have to do that eventually. So when it comes to mature teams, Mature teams tend to not want to do much planning. They would favor communication over a planning meeting for sure. They would basically say, just tell us what the job is, we'll have a quick discussion and we'll take care of it when we're doing it. So they'll tend to want to swarm together rather than hold all of these ritualistic, rigid meetings and processes. The mature team will know each other in and out, and they'll have their processes so well tuned that they can deploy rapidly. They can deploy in the afternoon after doing the work in the morning. So if there's a feature that needs to be made, they're not going to wait until the end of the sprint to deploy this. They can say, well, I've done the work at 10 a.m. It's unit tested, it's integration tested. A QA person has seen it, the product owner saw it and they like it. Why can't we deploy it before lunch? So when it comes to mature teams, they will tend to think that sprints are actually too slow, and they will lean more towards what's more like a Kanban workflow. If you don't know what Kanban is, I highly recommend you look it up. Kanban is all about making sure that your flow is smooth and it optimizes your processes for delivery. So I've talked about a few concepts. Now, what happens if you have inter and intra-team dependencies, varied service types, support agreements, and emergencies, and all these happening at the same time? That's right. I'm talking about what happens when you work at an agency. Anyone that works at an agency will know what I mean. It is like a house on fire. Sometimes it feels like you're trying to put out an atom bomb using a garden hose. It doesn't have to be like this. So this brings me to the reason I created this talk. So ringfence the chaos. So what do I mean by this? So we had some teams. So here's a build team. It has a Scrum Master, a UI, UX people, front end, back end, QA. Then we had what we called a support maintenance team, and this was dubbed Team Chaos. There was a PM, front end, back end developer, QA, and the reason we called this Team Chaos was because I realized that a lot of the chaos and disorder that happened in the organization was because of all the ad hoc things. So I created a team around this type of work, and their main purpose was to isolate all of that chaos so that the other teams wouldn't be affected. We also had this loose notion of what's called a design interface team. So basically, the organization didn't just do development. There were definitely some design-only projects. So this had a PM, a UX, and UI people. And there was this notion of a skill pool. So these are kind of free-floating skill sets. RS stands for research strategy. And the idea is when these people are not busy on something, they can float between either projects or the support maintenance team and boost productivity. And the great thing about this is people go away for holidays for like 20, 25 days per year. Plus there's times when people are sick. So if you have a team that only has one front-end developer, well, that front-end developer will be away for a minimum 20 days in the year. So if your project goes for a year, at some point there will be a complete stop of work. And that's assuming that they don't call in sick either. So having a skill pool where you can boost velocity in some times when people are available, that means that you don't have to fear the times when people are going to be away. So you can always maintain a good average velocity over the course of the project. When it comes to methodologies, the build team was running Scrum. The design team was running a waterfall process because the types of projects that they were doing were very, very heavily prescriptive. So they were doing things like brand work and things like billboards and magazines and things like this. And the support maintenance was doing Kanban. So this was essentially the work would come in and it would be lined up in a queue, and these people would just churn through that work. They'll just do it. Oh, I just noticed that there's a missing, nope, nope, we're fine. I thought there was a missing skill set in the support team. Anyway, so anytime an emergency happens, that team can handle it. It just goes to the top of the queue. It doesn't go to the bottom, and they can handle the chaos of that emergency, and it doesn't affect any of the other teams. So, in summary, I have been every single one of these people in this GIF at some point, working in agencies. And what I've learned essentially is to fix this chaos, you really need to notice where the bottlenecks are and where the disruptions are in the organization. And that may be in your team, it may be in your department, it may be external, but you need to figure out where those disruptions are. And you need to optimize your processes so that you can give business value. So there's no point having process for the sake of process. It needs to give some value to the business, and it can't just be hindering other people or other departments. It actually needs to solve a specific problem. Yes, you may have some processes which will be a little bit slower, but if you solve a very specific problem, then maybe the gains outweigh the negatives. When it comes to methodologies, as I said, you can't just say, I want to run everything agile, or I just want to be Scrum, or sometimes Scrum isn't good enough. Maybe the team doesn't want Scrum. Maybe the team is very mature and they want something more close to Kanban. Or maybe the team doesn't know how to do agile at all and they need to do Waterfall because that's just how they're used to working. And then you have to teach them how to be more agile, and that takes time. So you have to be flexible with methodologies. You can't just say, we're an agile agency. And most importantly, form teams around bits of work and types of work. This allows you to ring fence the chaos and allows other teams to stay more efficient. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions.